Hello, Gremlins and Gunners. My name is TB Skyn, and there's been a bit of a lore update to a couple of the Yordle champions in League of Legends, Lulu and Tristana specifically, who have been given a shiny new short story where they do a bit of a buddy comedy routine. But in order to analyze that one, I thought first, well, we should probably analyze the characters who are involved. We've already done Lulu, so now it's time to ask what's the deal with Tristana. Now, Tristana is a very, very, very old champion in League of Legends, one of the oldest ones in the game. In fact, she launched with the game all the way the heck back in Alpha, which is something like 9 years ago at this point, I think. And over the course of that time, she remained for the longest time very, very unchanged. She's had a few different lore states, but her character design and her model were completely the same. I think maybe they got a texture update at some point until her rework, which is what you're looking at right now, that brought her into a modern production quality with League of Legends that you can actually, show her off without feeling kind of shameful about the terrible character model. And with that lore update also, with that visual update also came a lore update, except not very much of one. In fact, since the 2014 lore retcon, Tristana has barely had any lore at all, beyond a very basic outline of this is her personality, and she has a cannon, and she does some stuff, and that was sort of all we really knew about her. So with Tristana getting a proper bio update to her name, we finally have an actual lore to put to the Yordle. Well, sort of. We had a little bit before that, but we'll get to that in due time. The first thing we're going to be looking at, well, we're going to be looking at her lore. We're going to be looking at the history of her lore, like what she used to be. She used to not be a Yordle. In fact, she used to be a Megling. We'll cover that stuff, how her lore kind of evolved into what it is now. Then we'll take a look at her character design and have a discussion about that. So, the first thing we're going to be doing is taking a look at her oldest lore. This is the Alpha Week 6 lore when she was released back in March 25th, 2009, and you can see some of it is in fact missing because a lot of the content from League of Legends back in those days is actually very poorly archived. Still, in this very early release lore, we learn that Tristana is a Megling. If there's one thing that all Meglings have in common is their love of explosions. And so, the Megling race, at least as far as I can make out, I didn't play League of Legends back in those days. I was too busy being a nerd about something else. I don't know. As best as I can tell with Meglings, they were essentially a riff on the World of Warcraft gnomes, in the sense that they are tiny humanoids who are obsessed with machinery and explosions and stuff like that. And so there's, she's an artillery, your tiny gnome who's not a gnome, we call her Megling instead, who does stuff with guns. This also became one of the first major sort of lore retcons in League of Legends, where they basically, in version 1 of the game, removed the Yordles, removed the Meglings from the lore. Instead, the Megling became a person, a valiant founder of the Commandos, and Tristana then becomes a Yordle who joins the Megling Commandos, but who is not Megling from like a racial perspective. She's still a Yordle. That was one of the first major lore retcons that Riot did, was to get rid of these bloody Meglings because they kind of just confused matters and they prefer to just roll everything into the Yordles. That of course created a second problem. Why does Tristana look like that when that looks absolutely nothing like the other Yordle champions, like for instance Heimerdinger? Well, that became a problem that Riot took a very, very, indeed very long time to resolve. In fact, for a time in the League of Legends lore, there was a purported romance between Teemo and Tristana, which again raises a bit of questions. Like, Teemo they don't look like they're from the same species very much at all, which raised perhaps a few uncomfortable questions. Which then was finally gotten rid of with the lore update to Tristana and the visual update that brought her to her current state of visual design and to this particular state of lore design. It's not much. In fact, it's not really anything. Tristana was always inspired by the adventures of great warriors. She had heard about Runeterra, she set foot in there and she had a cannon, and now she leaps into battle for, I don't know, reasons. Her personality was sort of very vaguely sketched out in the lore that came along with her lore update, with her visual update. And it remained that way for quite a long time until, in fact, very recently. Not quite today, because I'm making these videos after the fact, but until very recently. And now, Tristana finally has herself a fully fledged lore, which manages to give her not just a personality, but also a little bit of a backstory and something of a personal quest, like a thing that she wants to do, a thing that she wants to accomplish, which is kind of important for constructing narratives around a character, is that they should have something that they want and a reason to want to do it. before we get into that, one thing I want to note, though, take a careful look at this version of Tristana right here, and then a version of this Tristana right here. It's going to be important later. We'll come back to it. So, Tristana's new lore it tries to retain the outlines of what was shown in her post-rework lore, in the sense that she's an adventurous Yordle who sort of travels into Runeterra and sees a whole bunch of stuff and is inspired by that, and inspired by the warriors and inspired by the militaries that she sees to take up arms herself in order to protect Bandle City. That sort of jives okay with the lore that they wrote for her for the visual update that she got. In the case of her actual lore, Tristana is like someone who's adventurous. She travels around outside of Bandle City. Bandle City, once again, in the modern state of League of Legends lore, is a sort of parallel dimension to Runeterra. It's this little pocket dimension that exists and is accessible only through magical portals that Yordles can access, and Bandle City itself is a weird place where time doesn't really exist and the laws of physics don't fully apply, so the human world is very different and the Yordles are fascinated by it, but it also messes with them a little bit. It changes their behavior. They're easily influenced by what they see mortals do, which is why Kled is the way he is, because he lives in Noxus, and he's influenced by that particular country and its whole vibe, and it's why Poppy is the way she is, because she lives in Demacia, and she's influenced by the ways that, Demacians think, and the way Demacian culture exists. In Tristana's case, she spends a lot of time around warriors, and especially around militaries. She watched awestruck as great armies marched with unity and precision, incredibly strange concepts to a Yordle, across the endless sands to the south. But Tristana's carefree wandering ways changed the day she witnessed the destruction of a Bandlewood. These places are steeped in the magic of gateways, and they grow around, giving Yordles a safe haven from the world. Tristana, dozing in the dappled sunshine, was shaken awake by the tree as the trees around her began to burn and topple. A warband of armored marauders rampaged through the woodland with fire and axes, led by a sorcerer wreathed in dark energy. Probably Noxians, but we don't actually particularly know. Anyway, Tristana witnesses the destruction of one of the Bandle portals, one of the means that the Yordles have to travel into Runeterra, without which they are in fact trapped more or less in Bandle City. And Tristana doesn't like that. She feels pretty awful that she just kind of sat there and let them destroy a Bandle City portal. So she decides to make herself a cannon. And this is where the influence that she feels from the mortal world comes into play. She essentially starts to adopt a militaristic outlook on life. She starts calling her food rations, she starts making schedules for herself, rest and relaxation, starts patrolling, while carrying around a giant cannon that she calls Boomer, that she sort of based on the cannons that she saw in Bilgewater. So she takes all these influences from the outside world and uses it to sort of turn herself into a military protector of the various Bandlewoods, the various portals to Bandle City. And again, showing the sort of easily influenced nature of Yordles, Tristana herself has become a bit of a legend in Bandle City, and a bunch of Yordles have started to imitate her, essentially, without really understanding it, making themselves her recruits in this burgeoning commando military that she has accidentally managed to form. Especially Rumble seems to have taken a real shine to Tristana. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, hint, hint. And keeps trying to build weapons in order to win her approval. And this leads to the formation of the Bandle Gunners, which is a military unit, essentially, that seeks to protect Bandle City and indeed the portals to Bandle City. And Tristana then has her quest, and she has some interesting, amusing personal complications that add a little bit of a color and flavoring to this. She wants to protect the Bandle City portals, but at the same time, she's also accidentally become the troop leader, or indeed the military commander, of a small unit of Bandle Gunners, and she has a lovesick Yordle chasing her around in the form of Rumble and his giant, unstable mechanical mech suits. So she essentially takes on the role of a little bit of a straight man in a lot of the dynamics of Bandle City, which is something we're going to get to once we get to the Lulu and Tristana joint short story, which is hopefully going to be the next video I make after this one. In general, I really, really, really like the lore update to Tristana, because like I've mentioned a couple of times, it gives her a clear and present purpose. Like, she wants to protect the Bandlewoods. She wants to protect Bandle City from the destruction of, careless humans who just kind of break things without really thinking about them. And in order to do that, she's been influenced by the human world that has given her the means to, enact that protection. And what I really like about it is that there's a because story structure here. Because Tristana saw the destruction of a Bandlewood, she started taking up weapons. And because she had seen human militaries and she'd been influenced by the mortal world, she patterned herself after human sort of military standards and stuff like that, and created a military structure around her own life. And because she created that military structure and because she was successful, she garnered herself a lot of attention, including the romantic affection of Rumble and the sort of the admiration of her recruits. And because her recruits are sort of dangerously incompetent and would have hurt themselves without her guidance, she sort of is driven into becoming their leader, even though she kind of prefers to be on her own. So there's a lovely chain of events here that gives us this interesting cast of characters. Immediately you can imagine the hilarious interactions she has with her sort of very enthusiastic but incompetent and bumbling recruits who don't really know what end of a cannon is which, and her interactions with Rumble, who's constantly trying to impress her. All of that springs to mind very clearly from this particular lore, which is something I really like when lore manages to do that, when it manages to make my brain jump ahead and start imagining all the cool, fun adventures that this character can go on. That's when I know the concept is sound. That's when I know there's a good quest, there's a good personality, and there's a good supporting cast of characters that can provide some color to the whole thing. So in general, this is like an A+ lore update for me. It's just, it's really good, and it doesn't really have any substantial flaws, except, of course, that Riot being Riot, we don't have a lot of actual lore and stories based on this basic bio, which is something, hopefully, that they're going to be fixing in the future. So, Tristana, I lied a little bit when I said that after the lore rework, Tristana didn't have any lore whatsoever. She does have this thing, A Quiet Night, which is a short story that was released, I can't remember if it was released directly in conjunction with her visual and gameplay update or if it was released later, but it was based on Tristana before her bio got this particular update. And it was based on the Yordles at a slightly earlier point in time in their modern history, because like I said, the Yordle history of League of Legends is a mess. Like, it's a bloody mess. It started with the Yordles and Meglings, and then there were only Yordles, but some of them looked like gnomes because they were designed to be Meglings, but then they weren't Meglings. And then Bandle City was a city-state. In the old lore, it was like an actual physical place in the world, but then the new lore, it was like, we don't know, Bandle City is like, it's somewhere, I don't know, we're not going to deal with it for a very long time. And then, Bandle City is like an alternate dimension, kinda. There's portals and stuff that go into it, but we don't really know what it is. And then, they've sort of been assembling a lore and a concept of what the Yordles are, piece by piece. And in certain pieces of Yordle lore, they're portrayed essentially as sprites, essentially as fae, as little fairies of the League of Legends world, which is why they're so easily influenced by humans, which is why they're so changeable and mercurial, and which is why they're magical. We see that especially in the Paint the Town Red comic with Siggs and Jinx, where Siggs and Heimerdinger live in Piltover and conceal themselves, their Yordle nature, from the humans by means of special hex tech devices that Heimerdinger has invented, right? So their ability to conceal themselves from humans is based on technology. But then there's this story, A Quiet Night, where basically the story goes that Tristana is like hanging out in the human world doing stuff, not really entirely sure what the heck she's doing. Then she's assaulted by bandits, and then she blows them all completely to pieces because she's a Yordle and they don't know how to deal with that. Also, she has a huge cannon. But one of the things that happens in this story is that the bandits that approach her mistake her for an old woman. And at least insofar as the story implies, the case is that anyone who sees a Yordle out in the world will be fooled into thinking that there's something else. In Tristana's case, they think she's an old, bent-over old woman who's completely harmless and doesn't threaten them, until they realize she's a Yordle, at which point they might be able to see her for who she is, which is something that's brought up again in the Tristana Lulu joint short story. We'll deal with that a little bit later on, which once again raises the question of what the hell are Yordles supposed to... Are they magical creatures that can magically conceal themselves from the eyes of humans like fairies, or are they like an actual species of living physical animal who have to use technology to conceal themselves? Riot have not quite clarified, but there's more evidence to suggest that they are fairy creatures than they are, creatures that have to rely on technology. So I just wanted to bring it up because this story was written at a somewhat earlier point in time in the conception of Yordles. But it did do a good job back in the day of establishing Tristana's particular personality. For one thing, she doesn't really seem to react very much emotionally to killing human beings. Like, human beings die around her during this, like, she's assaulted, fair enough, but she's also like, when they die, she doesn't care that much. She's not really distressed by it at all, which is an important point to note, is that Tristana, despite being all cute and adorable, is still perfectly capable and happy to murder people. So, let's finally talk about the actual character design of this character, and especially let's talk about it in relationship to, well, our previous subject on the video series, Lulu, because there's a couple of things I want to bring up when it comes to the comparison between old Yordles and new Yordles. And the main thing I want you to look at is the shape of the face and the shape of the eyes, and indeed the size of the eyes, where Lulu has the problem that we talked about extensively in her video, that she essentially just kind of looks like a small human, because her eyes are proportional to the skull in a certain way. She's got the nose thing and you know, painted lips. I don't know why she's wearing lipstick, but, you know, whatever. Tristana is a very different thing. Now, there's still human-like features to her face. She doesn't look like particularly like an animal, but there's also a couple of different things going on. Look at the proportion of the eyes to the size of the head. These eyes are very huge. Indeed, the pupils and the irises are huge as well, and that gives her an animalistic look to her proportions that really Lulu doesn't quite have. Lulu still looks like just a tiny human person, especially with those horrifying human-looking hands, like, oh, they're so slender and Whereas Tristana, both with her much larger digits on her hands, and with these much larger eyes that make her look a little bit more like a rat or some kind of rodent than particularly just a small human being, does a lot to set her apart and to identify her more as a fantasy race of creatures that are not human. It also helps that she's got the fuzzy little ears, of course, although in many other respects, Riot seem to have decided that female Yordles in particular don't look as animalistic as their male Yordle counterparts, where male Yordles, especially like Six and Rumble and Kled, look entirely like tiny furries, while the female Yordles have a tendency to look somewhat more human in their colors and proportions. You can also see on Tristana's splash art here that her entire face is meant to be a little bit fuzzy. Like, she's supposed to be covered in short purple fur, essentially. She is supposed to be a fuzzy, furry little creature, just not as explicitly fuzzy and furry as her male Yordle counterparts, which is a aesthetic decision that, I mean, I can't help but think it's for the lewd fan artists out there. I can't help but think that Riot are like, well, we want them to still be able to draw, like, naughty pictures of these characters, so we're not going to make them too animalistic. And I was like, first of all, they underestimate fan artists if they think that's going to stop them, but on the other hand, secondly, it's also kind of, it's not a great rationale for doing it. Like, if that indeed is reason, it's the only reason I can think of why female Yordles uniformly seem to be much more human-like, even as they do, like, successfully look like something inhuman, but that female Yordles, you know, consistently look more human-like than male Yordles, which is something that has always kind of bothered me a little bit. Anyway, Tristana's outfit design is actually quite sensible. Now, she's got the bare midriff thing going on, and I think that's primarily to highlight her athleticism. It's also to make her look cuter, I would imagine, but I think it's partly to highlight her athleticism, where if she was wearing a full, like, bomb suit, essentially, with all the padding and all the leather stuff going on that's on it, she would look a little bulky. And a huge part of the visual communication of Tristana is centered around her ability to rocket jump. Like, that's a huge part of both her animation set, but certainly also, let's see, there it is. Yeah, there's the rocket jump animation, where you can see that a lot of emphasis is placed on Tristana as an athletic character. And you can kind of see that come across in the way that you can see how she vaults over the rocket, kind of pulling it up along with her, and then sort of shouldering its weight as she comes down like that. And that's something that's in, let's see if I can find the particular one I was looking for. It's not the mid, it's the, yeah, there it is. The long version of the animation, where you can really see that, like, that athletic nature is a key part of her visual identity when it comes to how she looks as a character. And this is something that also comes across, especially in her idol animations, because even her most, you know, inanimate idol still has her, like, this is her basic state of being. It's just bounce, 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 up and down. And I especially like the particular rhythm of this little bit of animation, because you can see how Tristana bounces up, then the cannon follows, and then she goes down, and then the cannon goes down, and she goes up. And you can kind of see how they establish that alternating rhythm where Tristana and the cannon seem to kind of bounce on different beats, which is a really good way to show that the cannon has a ton of weight, whereas Tristana herself is very light and agile, in terms of the way her animation set is created, which is something I quite like. And I think that's part of the reason also why they gave her the bare midriff, was essentially to emphasize her, the idea of her more as a gymnast than as an artillery person, which I think makes sense. But on the other hand, they've also been careful to, like, her gloves, which are heavily padded. You've got the heavy padding over the chest area, you've got the padding on the knees, you've got the padding on the other arm, where they're also making sure to communicate, okay, this lady is also, like, she deals with impacts and explosions, and she does need some protection from some of that, which, you know, is a good way to design around the cannon without giving her an actual bomb suit. Now, if you wanted to be realistic about it, obviously Tristana should have a full bomb suit, because this is an actual piece of artillery right next to her, and when those things go off, the shockwaves are not just going to be hitting the enemies, like it should be tearing her shoulder out of its socket. But League of Legends isn't a realistic game, and so that isn't necessary, but it's still necessary to make some concessions to the idea that she needs some kind of protection, that she needs some specialized gear in order to keep herself safe from the cannon that she's carrying around, and they managed to do a pretty damn good job of this. I've always sort of been weirded out by the fact that she seems to carry grenades around with her. I guess those are her explosive charges? But they've always felt a little bit awkward, given that Tristana is entirely designed around her gun as her central mechanic, and as her central, like, as just her central character design point. Like, the gun is as big as the rest of her character model entirely. It's half of her character model by volume. And so the idea that she has grenades on top of that is a little... If they looked more explicitly like she was carrying ammunition, cannonballs, rather than those little grape things that she's got going on there, it would make maybe a little bit more sense, but that's a minor nitpick, really. Another minor nitpick is that she's wearing goggles on the top of her head, which again is, like, goggles on a character's head is such a common signifier that this character is some kind of a machinist or engineer. Like, they work with some kind of machine where you might need eye protection in order to safely interact with it. Siggs does exactly the same thing, so does Heimerdinger. The thing that always kind of bothers me about Tristana is that she never puts them on. Like, they're just there, and that's something that kind of bothers me in general with character design, where characters are given accessories, but, like, accessories that have a clear and present function. Like, her earring is just an accessory. It doesn't need a function. It can just be an earring that's there because it's a lovely little character design element that gives her a little bit of asymmetry in the design, which is very appealing. But then the goggles, which, like, she has the big giant cannon, she's clearly dealing, like, conscious of some kind of self-defense and self-protection with all the padding on her suit. She's got the goggles, but she never wears them. And that's a pet peeve of mine. Like, if she doesn't need them, don't put them on her. If she does need them, at least have her wear them or be able to put them on in the same way that Kai'Sa can put on her, like, cyber helmet or whatever. But just having them sitting there uselessly on the top of her head is one of my little pet peeves as a character designer. It's one of those little annoying things. It's the thing I find vaguely annoying about steampunk cosplay sometimes as well, is that they will just, like, add gears and, you know, steam vents and goggles and all kinds of things to their costume without any sense of what any of those things might serve as a purpose, where it becomes just aesthetic. And it's not, like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not bad or evil or stupid or anything like that. It's just a pet peeve of mine. But of course, the reason why she doesn't put on the goggles is because they don't want to cover up those big, giant, adorable eyes, which are a huge part of her character appeal, to be fair. I'm still kind of... I don't know why they wanted to make her wear eyeshadow specifically. It seems a little bit redundant with the character. But the giant eyes, which look substantially less appealing this up close, don't you think? Like, ooh, this is not fun anymore. Now she's adorable again. The giant eyes, as I talked about earlier, is a important part of how we distinguish a character design like Tristana from a character design like Lulu, where Lulu has the problem of looking like a human. Tristana emphatically does not. Like, she sort of has the proportions of a human child or a very young human, but those big giant eyes are the thing that really kind of sets her facial anatomy apart. Like, anime girls can have eyes this big, this much is true, but on something that looks so distinctly physical as her, it does set her apart as a different species, and so do, of course, the giant fuzzy ears that look kind of like, bat ears? Rodent ears? Something along those lines. So yeah, Tristana as a character design is top tier. Like, she's a fantastically well-realized design. There isn't, I mentioned a bunch of nitpicks with the grenades and the goggles and stuff like that, but none of it really detracts from the quality of the design. She's a character who's cute and, like, who can be constructed as a little bit sexy without being a sexualized character sort of pointlessly. There is an athleticism to her, there's a litheness and a lightness to her motions that justifies the very, you know, light clothing that she wears. And I especially adore her run animation. Like, this is her fast run animation, and this one is already really good. Like, take a look at, again, notice how the weight of the cannon, you can see how Tristana, at the top of her jump, she falls down first, and then the cannon follows, because it has greater inertia. And you can see how when she jumps, she kind of has to pull the cannon up with her a little bit, which is just a lovely little bit of character animation. That's really all I wanted to say. But then there's her hasted run. Look at this. This I really, really like, is particularly because look how much she's leaning. The cannon here, like I said, it's half of her character model by volume. Like, it's the size of the rest of her body. And the weight of the cannon is so important to a lot of Tristana's character animation. So here, the animator has the inspired idea of, okay, she's carrying the cannon with one arm, so she's leaning over way the hell in the other direction of the cannon's weight in order to compensate for it. Which is such a good way to show the weight of the thing in the movement of the character and the way the character behaves around it without, like, running into the trouble of, okay, but realistically, someone that small should not be able to lift a cannon that big. Like, that simply shouldn't be able to happen. And you can see them playing with that. This is her run when she's slowed by anything, and it has some truly amazing freeze frames. Look at that. Where you can see they're using the weight of the cannon in a different way. Now, instead of the cannon being an easy companion that she can just kind of carry with her, no problem, it becomes a millstone, essentially. A millstone around her neck that she kind of has to drag along the ground because it's too heavy for her to carry effectively when she's slowed down. And that's a great way to use the weight of the cannon in multiple ways to express the character's personality when it comes to, you know, their behavior in game. But the thing I really love about the hasted run here is, you see the timing? The timing on when she's up and when she's down. When a character is hasted in League of Legends, or indeed when characters run in League of Legends, it's really hard to match the speed of their actual movement animation and the length of their stride to the distance they actually cover in the game itself. Like, that's something that's difficult in all video games, but where you can get video games where a character will have a walk or run cycle that's too fast or too slow for how fast they actually move across the screen, which is a huge problem. And one of the ways this little bit of animation managed to solve that problem is, like, Tristana has very short legs. She can't actually move that fast, is by essentially turning her run into a series of leaps. You can see how she's essentially leaping up into the air. And the clever thing about that is that once she's off the ground, you don't have to match the speed of her legs to how fast she's moving. You can move her as fast as you want, and as long as she touches down every once in a while and jumps back up into the air, you can mess with her movement speed as much as you want, which is a great way to do the hasted run for the characters, which is something you'll see in a lot of the champions when they have their hasted run cycles. A lot of them will just fly, because, like, that's the easiest way to match the movement speed of their body to their movement speed across the ground in a lot of cases. Which is a sensible way to solve it, but just getting the character off the ground. But again, it's that integration with the weight of the cannon itself that I really love. Where, again, you can see that Tristana is at the peak of her jump, then they do a little bit of stretching with her leg down, and then she hits the ground, and she hits the ground here, right? And you can see she settles her weight down here. Here she reaches, like, the knee is bent, and she's about to get ready to push back up out again. And you can see then the cannon kind of follows down, and then as she jumps, the cannon has to be dragged up with her. And managing weight like that, at least to me, is one of the hardest disciplines in animation, is to always be conscious of the weight you're throwing around and making that weight feel real. even though it's in very objective ways not, and even though you're objectively breaking every single possible law of physics by having a character carry something that is so big and clearly heavier than them, to make that weight still feel present in the character design. This is something that's always kind of annoyed me about Yasuo and his character design, is that he has this giant, ridiculous arm protector, arm guard thing sitting on his on his shoulder that looks like it should weigh 150 pounds or something. It looks like it should be absolutely massive, but he just kind of moves around and ignores the weight like it's nothing, which of course is because he's a cool samurai and it's probably made of, I don't know, mithril or some weightless material like that. But to me, that's always felt unreal. Like, it has made him feel a little bit plastic, which is something I don't really like to see in character animation, but it's why I've spent so much time just appreciating. And by the way, just appreciate the follow-through that happens in the rest of the character model. See how when she hits the ground, look at her hair? Look how it flaps around in response to her weight hitting the ground. And then she goes up, and down it comes again, ready to do a little bit more of a flip. And the same thing with her ears. The ears are so expressive in Tristana's animation as well. Look at that. Boing. Look how the ears bounce along with her weight, which is what gives her animation that lovely sense of life, which is also important to the personality of the character, right? She's supposed to be this sort of intelligent, very inquisitive, very curious. There it is. The curious, light, athletic, happy young Yordle who's got a lust for life and a zest for experience, right? And so having those little elements of her character that bobs up and down and that move, it's a really good way to do that. That's also, by the way, part of the reason why the eyes need to be so damn big, because she's curious, because she's out here to see the world and she wants to see what's happening out there. Anyway, yeah, I love the animation on Tristana's model, by the way, in case you can't tell. I think it's some of the better animation in League of Legends. It's showing its age a little bit. I think you can see a few places in the rig and stuff where more recent champions will probably be able to do it a little bit more fluidly, but I just really like this run cycle. I was looking at it when I was preparing to do this video, and I just kept, oh, this is so cool. Oh, look at that thing. Look at this thing. Anyway, where the hell was I? I was talking about Tristana, wasn't I? Yes, Tristana. Overall, just a really damn good champion character design. Now a champion character design with a really good lore to go along with it. That gives us a clear idea of what she's supposed to do and how we're supposed to approach her as a character. That'll do for an outro, won't it? Holy crap, this video is already over half an hour long. Well, that's what happens when I start getting into the weeds of what I like about animation. If you have enjoyed that, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube buttons. The reason why YouTubers ask you to hit those buttons all the time is because we depend on the goddamn algorithm, and if people don't hit the buttons, then the algorithm thinks our channel is dead, and then it decides to bury us before we have actually been killed. So if you want to help me not be killed and buried by the algorithm in a metaphorical mass grave of online content creation, well, please do hit the buttons. If you want to support the channel more directly, well, Patreon is right there for that. If you have $1 a month that you don't mind me having instead, well, you can head on over there and subscribe to whatever you want. If you don't want to do a monthly subscription thing, well, you can head on over to my tip jars, which are down in the description. You can do some direct donations over there, which also help me out a lot. As I say at the end of my videos, $1 to a content creator like me can be the same as 1,000 or even thousands of views on online content. It matters so much more than you think, even the very small amounts. So whether it's me or whether it's another content creator whose work you enjoy, please consider supporting us directly with even the smallest amount of money, because it matters, and it's the main thing that lets us sometimes ignore the algorithm and actually do what we want without having to chase trends or do clickbait. That's every content creator I know would rather be directly supported by their fans than be slaves to, you know, ads or sponsorships and stuff like that. So whether it's me or someone else, just please support content creators when you can. What else? I don't think there's anything else. It's just, if you haven't liked the video, there's a dislike button, I guess. And if you don't click the dislike button within the next 9 seconds, it will self-destruct and you will never be able to dislike another video ever again. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,